For centuries, the chamber beneath the Capitoline had held Rome's enemies. Foreign kings, captured generals, men whose names appeared in triumphal processions before they vanished. The Tullianum was for exactly one purpose: what Rome did to those who were not Roman. On the night of December 5, 63 BC, 5 men were lowered through the hole in its floor. They were not foreign kings. They were not captured generals. They held Roman citizenship. They had never renounced it. The praetors did not check. We are taught that the law is a sacred shield, designed to protect the innocent from the wicked. But in the twilight of the Roman Republic, the law became a razor-sharp weapon used to defend the very men trying to burn the city to ashes. Faced with a cataclysmic conspiracy, the mighty Senate was paralyzed not by foreign swords, but by their own legal statutes. Cato roared for the immediate slaughter of citizens to save the state, while Caesar chillingly championed mercy to protect the Constitution. Two titans collided in a philosophical slaughterhouse, reducing the Senate floor to an ideological battlefield of desperation and deceit. When a nation decides to suspend its laws to survive, who truly wins? The defenders of a republic, or the tyrants waiting in the shadows? It was not in the blood of foreign wars, but in the cold, paralyzed heart of Rome itself. The gathering storm. On the morning of the 5th of December, 63 BC, 5 men sat in custody, detained in the private residences of prominent senators. They were Publius Cornelius Lentulus Sura, a man of patrician blood who had once worn the purple-bordered toga of a consul; Gaius Cethegus, Lucius Statilius, Publius Gabinius Capito, and Marcus Superius. They were the lieutenants of the rebel senator Lucius Sergius Catiline. They were ringleaders of a ruthless conspiracy tasked with burning Rome to the ground, slaughtering its magistrates, and absolving all debts. The rebel senator Catiline has fled the city to raise an army, leaving behind a network of conspirators tasked with burning Rome to the ground. 2 days ago, 5 of these ringleaders were arrested in their homes. The men in custody were undeniably guilty of treason, caught red-handed with letters soliciting foreign armies, sealed wax, and the testimony of foreign envoys who would not lie for Rome's enemies. But they were also Roman citizens. The Senate of the Roman Republic hurriedly convened. The Senate did not meet in its usual house that day. The Curia stood too exposed, too easily rushed by a mob that might yet come for the prisoners or for the men who judged them. So the fathers of Rome filed instead into the Temple of Concord, at the base of the Capitoline, under a roof built to commemorate the peace between Patrician and Plebeian 2 centuries before. Outside, armed knights ringed the building. Presiding over this extraordinary assembly was Marcus Tullius Cicero. As consul, he wielded the absolute executive authority of Imperium. He held the backing of the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, an emergency decree instructing him to safeguard the state by any means necessary. Yet, this decree offered only moral support. It did not grant formal legal immunity for the extrajudicial killing of Roman citizens. Cicero hesitated to use his power alone. He required the Senate to assume collective responsibility for the executions he intended to carry out. His face etched with the exhaustion of sleepless nights, reflected the grave burden of the hour. The fate of the 5 prisoners, and the Republic itself, hung in the balance. The question echoing through the marble columns was not merely what to do with guilty traitors, but whether the strict adherence to Roman legal statutes could be suspended to preserve the state. A republic in terminal transition. Lucius Sergius Catiline was a member of an ancient but impoverished patrician family. He appeared in history first as a supporter of Sulla. During the proscriptions, he was conspicuous for his greed and his cruelty. His delight, from his youth, had been civil commotions, bloodshed, robbery, and sedition. He spent his early years submerged in these scenes. His constitution endured hunger, want of sleep, and cold to a degree surpassing belief. His mind was daring, subtle, and versatile. He was capable of pretending or dissembling whatever he wished. He possessed abundance of eloquence, though but little wisdom. He coveted the property of other men. He was prodigal of his own. The violence he inflicted was intimate and absolute. In 82 BC, when dictator Sulla unleashed his infamous proscriptions, he had tortured and mutilated the much-loved Marius Gratidianus. Up until the very threshold of the consulship, Catiline was a highly successful, mainstream politician. He flawlessly ascended Rome's traditional elite path, the cursus honorum. Elected as praetor in 68 BC, he served as the governor of the African province, propraetor, from 67 to 66 BC. Until this point, he was the ultimate insider of Roman politics, the undisputed frontrunner for the next consulship. However, when he returned to Rome in 66 BC following his term, ready to take the natural next step and run for consul, the provincials of Africa dragged him before the Roman courts on charges of severe extortion and embezzlement, de reputandis. Under the Roman election laws of the time, anyone standing trial was barred from registering as a consular candidate. To secure an acquittal, he was forced to lavish astronomical bribes upon the jury and the prosecution. It was exactly here that his unmanageable, crushing debt began to spiral. Catiline remained a client, whether his debts were small or astronomical. Unlike Caesar, he could not turn his creditors into his own clients. In the consular election of 64 BC, he was defeated, eclipsed by the meteoric rise of Cicero, a plebeian-born genius orator. For the election of 63 BC, Catiline returned with a radical pledge: the total cancellation of all debts, tabulae novae. Terrified by his extremism and massive debt, the Senate conservatives systematically funneled their votes to rival candidates, handing Catiline yet another devastating defeat. His violent spirit was daily hurried on by the diminution of his patrimony and by his consciousness of guilt. The corrupt morals of the state, which extravagance and selfishness rendered thoroughly depraved, furnished him with additional incentives to action. Catiline flourished in this environment. He attracted gamblers, gluttons, and criminals. Even back in 64 BC, Catiline delivered a speech to his conspirators characterizing the ruling class of Rome as rich and tyrannical. He portrayed himself and his followers as yearning for freedom, positioning himself as a humble servant to be used for their liberation. When pressed to be specific, Catiline offered his listeners the abolition of debts, the proscription of the rich, offices, priesthoods, and plunder. He promised all the other spoils that war and the license of victors can offer. He revived memories of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, whose second dictatorship was a time of state-sanctioned murdering, plundering, and looting. On the night of November 6, 63 BC, Catiline and his co-conspirators met secretly at the house of Marcus Porcius Lica. There, they resolved to assassinate Consul Cicero the following morning. On the morning of November 7, the plot to murder the consul at his home was thwarted. An informant, Fulvia, had tipped Cicero off at dawn. Blocked by the consul's tight security detail, the assassins were turned away, and the true nature of the conspiracy was brought to light. By the 8th of November, an atmosphere of fear had spread across Rome. When Catiline boldly entered the Senate, Cicero delivered a brilliant, scathing speech against him. Catiline fired back, declaring his own nobility while slurring Cicero as a low-born immigrant. When the Senate shouted him down, Catiline yelled that he would put out his own personal fire through a general conflagration. That night, he sneaked out of the city to join Manlius and his rebel forces in Etruria, leaving his lieutenants behind to recruit more traitors. He sent deceitful letters to nobles, claiming that everything was slander by his enemies and that he was leaving for exile in Massilia, in the best interests of the state. The 5 conspirators now awaiting judgment were the ultimate symptom of a republic that had consumed its own moral foundation. The voice of the law. Inside the Temple of Concord, the December air was sharp. Hundreds of senators sat in tiered rows, the heavy folds of their togas stark white against the shadows of the colonnades. The order of speaking followed a rigid hierarchy, starting with the princeps senatus, proceeding to the consuls-elect, and then the ex-consuls. Decimus Junius Silanus, the consul-elect for the upcoming year, received the floor first. His stance was swift and brutal. He proposed the ultimate penalty of immediate execution. A murmur of vengeful assent rippled through the gathered aristocrats, driven by the acute terror of the past weeks. Fear often demands blood, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed the matter would be resolved with extrajudicial violence. But the momentum was suddenly broken. Gaius Julius Caesar stepped forth. He was the praetor-elect, and had recently secured the powerful appointment of Pontifex Maximus. Tall, commanding, and radiating an unsettling calm amidst the panic, Caesar stood to counter the tide of bloodlust. Whispers already circulated that he harbored sympathies for the traitors. Caesar ignored the rumors. He addressed the law. Roughly 20 years after these events, as the historian Sallust would record in his masterwork, Bellum Catilini, Caesar warned the Senate against the dangers of yielding to wrath. He stated that it becomes all men who deliberate on dubious matters to be influenced neither by hatred, affection, anger, nor pity. With no theatricality, he argued that passion acts as a tyrant. Rome's ancestors, he reminded the fathers, had once let the Rhodians go unpunished for treachery, rather than be accused of seizing their wealth under cover of justice. Rome had let Carthage insult the treaty for years, rather than act from anger instead of judgment. When passion gains possession, reason becomes powerless. No human being has consulted, at the same moment, his passions and his interest. Caesar weaponized mercy. He did not plead for the character of the conspirators. Instead, he defended the sanctity of the Roman constitution. He invoked the Lex Portia and the Lex Sempronia, ancient, foundational statutes expressly forbidding the execution of any Roman citizen, without a formal trial and the fundamental right of provocatio, an appeal to the popular assembly. Roman citizens sentenced to die had for generations been permitted the alternative of exile, a tacit practice tolerated under these ancient statutes. To execute citizens, without trial, Caesar warned, would set a terrifying precedent. A law broken for a righteous cause remains a broken law, and a future faction could use that exact precedent to execute innocent men tomorrow. Invoking the bloody specter of Sulla's proscriptions, Caesar championed a strategic form of clementia. But in the political ecosystem of the late Republic, Caesar's clementia is not an expression of human kindness. It is a strategic counterweight to the tyrannical cruelty that had stained Rome in the recent past. It is a mechanism to assert moral superiority over his political rivals. This clementia would persist for the next 2 decades, ultimately becoming the direct or indirect cause of his destruction. He proposed an unprecedented, technical alternative. The Senate should confiscate all the property of the conspirators and condemn them to lifetime confinement, scattered and perpetually imprisoned within various heavily guarded municipalities of Italy. Anyone who attempted to propose their release would be declared an enemy of the state. By advocating this, Caesar positioned himself as the ultimate defender of constitutional precedent. He argued that to break the law in order to save the state was, in fact, to destroy the very soul of the state. It was a brilliant, confounding maneuver that halted the conservative optimates in their tracks. Caesar manipulated strict adherence to the law to shield men who had attempted to destroy it. This shifted the battlefield from treason to constitutional jurisdiction. Yet, his proposal is entirely unprecedented. Roman statutory law possesses no formal framework for life imprisonment as a punitive sentence. Caesar is offering a technical, extra-legal alternative masquerading as constitutional piety. The room fell silent. The prospect of exile satisfied the demand for punishment while preserving the sacred barrier of Roman citizenship. Cicero's friends leaned toward Caesar's proposal. Even Silanus began to backtrack. The paranoia and the letter. Yet, the tension within the temple was suffocating, soon reaching a breaking point that manifested in a bizarre moment of paranoia. As the debate raged, a messenger slipped onto the Senate floor and discreetly handed a small, sealed tablet to Caesar. Marcus Porcius Cato, a leading figure of the conservative faction, spotted the exchange. In an atmosphere where the men on trial had been caught exchanging treasonous letters, trust had entirely evaporated. Cato suspected illicit communication with the rebels outside the gates. He stopped the proceedings, pointed an accusing finger, and loudly demanded that Caesar read the letter aloud. With infuriating calm, Caesar silently handed the tablet to Cato. Upon reading it, Cato's face flushed, not with the triumph of uncovering treason, but with disgusted fury. It was a highly mundane, passionate love letter from Servilia, who happened to be Cato's own half-sister. Cato threw the tablet back, declaring, "Take it, you drunkard." The fleeting altercation laid bare the intensely personal animosities and mutual suspicions choking the Republic. These men were not merely debating legal theory. They are fighting for their political, and literal, survival. The ancestral sword. Humiliated but undeterred, Cato took the floor. He was 32 years old, the tribune elect, and a man carved from the rigid and compromising traditions of Rome's past. Where Caesar sought to navigate the letter of the law, Cato sought to obliterate Caesar's premise entirely. Cato declared that his feelings were extremely different when contemplating the imminent dangers facing Rome, compared to the abstract sentiments of the previous speaker. He did not flatter the room. He reminded the fathers of their villas, their statues, their imported marble, the pleasures they valued more than the republic that let them keep any of it. He told them plainly that none of it would survive a burning city, no matter how they voted today. He accused Caesar of considering only the technicalities of punishment, while an enemy operated within the walls and Catiline raised an army outside the gates. Stripping away the veneer of Caesar's clementia, Cato labeled it complicity. 17 years later, Cato could not possibly accept Caesar's clementia. Because to Cato, that clementia was Caesar himself. He did not argue that the lex Portia should be ignored. He argued it no longer applied. Sallust records how Cato forcefully argued that the conspirators had, by their own treasonous designs, effectively declared war on the state. He asserts that by conspiring to burn the city and slaughter its magistrates, Lentulus and his associates have stripped themselves of their civic identity. They are no longer citizens. They are hostes, foreign enemies of the state. To offer them the protection of the law was to invite the destruction of the lawgivers. Cato forcefully reframes the crisis. He invokes mor maiorum, the unwritten custom of the ancestors, arguing that tradition itself is constitutionally binding. He reminded the Senate of a time when greed was unknown, when ancestors were lavish in their offerings to the gods, frugal in the home, and loyal to friends. He pointed out that Athens' fame was greater than her deeds truly warranted, only because she educated men to write timeless histories, whereas Rome built her true greatness through action. Relying on the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, Cato demanded immediate execution, not just as a legal penalty, but as an act of absolute, existential state preservation. He rejected the delay of trials and the leniency of exile. If the state fell, the laws fell with it. He demanded blood. He demanded the immediate execution of the 5 detainees, insisting that only a display of utter ruthlessness would deter the rebel army waiting in the hills of Etruria. Cato closed on the ancestors again. Titus Manlius Torquatus, who 3 centuries before had ordered his own son executed for winning a battle against direct orders, because discipline outweighed even a father's pride in a son's courage. If Rome could do that to its own blood for disobedience, Cato asked, what was owed to men who had planned to burn the city and slaughter their neighbors in their beds? Punishment be inflicted, according to the usage of our ancestors, on the prisoners who have confessed their guilt, as on men convicted of capital crimes. The psychological clash dominated the temple. Caesar had offered a chilling, calculated advocacy for clemency masking ambition. Cato projected a desperate, moralistic fury to maintain the ancient order. The Senate floor transformed into a philosophical slaughterhouse. The momentum shifted a second time. Moved by Cato's unyielding conviction, the physical timeline of the chamber shifted visibly. Slowly, the senators rose. They physically walked across the floor, moving away from Caesar to crowd around Cato. They cast their vote by their physical presence. The visual weight of the Republic shifted decisively toward execution. The decree was passed. As the session dissolved, the atmosphere soured into potential violence. When Caesar would not stop pressing his objection even after the decree was made, Roman equites, wealthy knights serving as an armed guard, drew their weapons. Enraged by Caesar's defense of the condemned, their swords flashed in the dimming light, physically threatening him. The senators who sat next to Caesar looked at the steel. They moved away. Caesar remained in his position. A few friends stepped across the floor. They threw their arms around Caesar. They covered him with their togas. The blades stopped inches from the fabric. Nearly 20 years later, in another Senate building, blades would flash toward him once again. And on that day, the steel of his own clients would not halt in midair. Following the incident, Caesar confined himself to his home, never setting foot in the Senate for the remainder of the year. The descent into the earth. There was no delay. The executions were to be carried out immediately, lest the night provide an opportunity for a rescue attempt. Cicero, acting with deliberate and grim speed, took personal charge. Cicero descended from the Palatine Hill and went personally to the house where Publius Cornelius Lentulus Sura was held. The consul of Rome, flanked by his lictors, took the arm of the man who had once been a consul himself. He escorted him through the crowded, silent streets of the Forum. Praetors were dispatched to retrieve Cethegus, Statilius, Gabinius, and Superius. They arrived at the foot of the Capitoline Hill. They arrived at the Tullianum, the ancient and terrifying state prison. 12 feet beneath the surface of the earth, cut into the bedrock, lies a circular chamber. Its masonry is coarse and unyielding, built from heavy blocks of volcanic stone that absorb the cold and reject the light. There are no windows. In antiquity, the only entrance was a narrow hole cut into the floor of the room above. To enter this space was to leave the world of the living behind. Today, its vaulted roof and asymmetrical walls survive intact beneath the modern streets of Rome. Its dimensions have been meticulously surveyed and preserved within the digital archives of institutions. Lentulus was led to the upper chamber, bound, and lowered through the narrow hole, dropping 12 feet into the damp, lightless space below. The others followed. Inside the gloom, executioners were waiting. There was no trial. There were no speeches. There was no audience. One by one, the 5 men were strangled in the dark. When it was finished, Cicero emerged from the prison. He looked out at the anxious crowd gathered in the Forum, many of whom were hidden conspirators waiting for a signal to attack. Cicero uttered a single, chilling word in the perfect tense: Vixerunt. They have lived. Rome's grammar for the dead. The legacy of silence. The physical threat of the conspirators within the walls of Rome was over. Catiline's rebel army would soon be cornered and destroyed in the north. Cicero was hailed as the father of his country. The bodies remained in the chamber, and the scribes filed the wax tablets into the state records. While the sequence of these dark events remains clear, the historical archives reveal distinct gaps. There are no verbatim transcripts of the speeches delivered that day. The historical documents we possess are the retroactive battlegrounds of memory. Sallust crafted his account as a profound literary and philosophical monument to capture the ideological chasm of the era. Cicero heavily edited his fourth Catilinarian for publication years later to curate his legacy. Even ancient historians like Suetonius and Plutarch would later conflict on the precise timing of when the equites threatened Caesar, whether amidst the chaotic session itself or upon his solitary exit. But the ultimate truth of December 5, 63 BC, remains undeniable. The debate exposed a stark procedural division that would haunt Rome. The jurisprudential maneuver to reclassify citizens into enemies bypassed civil protections, fatally compromising the foundation of the state. 5 years later, a politician named Clodius Pulcher would weaponize this very day. He declared the executions to be extrajudicial murders and drove Cicero, the savior of Rome, into humiliating exile. The heavy stones of the Tullianum bore witness to the deaths of 5 men. But in the wider lens of history, they bore witness to something much larger. When a republic decides that its own survival requires the suspension of its laws, it crosses a threshold from which it rarely returns. The men in the Temple of Concord believed they were saving the Constitution. In reality, they had merely mapped the coordinates of its eventual ruin. 5 years after the Tullianum, a tribune named Clodius stood in the forum with a different question. Not whether the 5 conspirators had deserved death, whether Cicero had followed the law that guaranteed a trial to every Roman citizen. Clodius did not accuse Cicero of injustice. He accused him of skipping a step. The Senate that had once crowded around Cato scattered into new alliances. No one crowded around Cicero. He left Rome before the vote was finished. This time, someone checked.